And I want to introduce you to Kelly Beins. I just made her a doctor. Congratulations. Yep. So we're shifting gears. We're going to move to talking about OT and sensory stuff for the next bit. And I don't know about you all, but I know that my kid has a lot of things that he's working on, skills he's trying to develop, tools, resources, and a lot of things that I'm trying to figure out as a parent about how to support his sensory needs, how to help him sort of figure out strategies and tools and sort of really get clear about what's working and not working for him. And so that's what I'm really excited about. Our next presenter, Kelly Beins, is going to talk with us about how we do some of that thinking and understanding what's going on for our kids from a sensory perspective and how we can support their growth and development and what that means. So Kelly knows us through Martha and David and is based in Frederick, Maryland, which is actually not far from where I live, but that's neither here nor there. And we're really excited to welcome her. And she has a private practice in OT, occupational therapy, in Maryland. And I'm going to turn it over to her so she can get going on talking about this. So Kelly Beins.
Good morning. How many people have kids that have sensory issues? That's a lot of hands. How many people know somebody with sensory issues or have some yourself? Yeah, here and there. How many people have seen this face when they talk about sensory? Right? It's kind of confusing sometimes. And occasionally, you can talk to somebody who you think gets it. You're in the midst of a conversation, they're with you, you're describing some of the things that your child might do, and then all of a sudden you bring up sensory, and you see this face. What? Sensory? That's a thing? Well, it is. Even though some people go, right, sure it is. Sure, that's right. Well, it is, and it's based on science. And a little bit of background, the field of sensory integration and sensory processing began in the 70s with a woman named Jean Ayres. And she studied sensory issues in children who had learning disabilities. And so our field is pretty young when it comes to science and when it comes to medicine. And it's based on a lot of different fields of science. So I think that's where some of the confusion comes from. We integrate lots of different areas of the brain and the body. But I hope that today I can show you it's not rocket science. Sensory explains some of the very quirky, confusing things that people do, and it helps us understand what underlies behavior and function. I hope that today I can demystify some of those things, give you some strategies, and answer some of your questions. I would be remiss if I didn't thank these two people and Martha, Chandler's mom. I want to thank David and Martha for letting me share all of the images. I'm nervous now that I show Chandler. Letting me share the images that are here today and for letting me accompany you on your journey. Sensory is about the brain and the body. It's about how the brain and body work together. But it's also about how the brain and body work together within our environment to do everyday tasks. Virginia Spielman, the executive director of the STAR Institute in Denver, Colorado, and the STAR Institute, for those who don't know, is the leading research, treatment, and education center for sensory processing disorder. I direct everybody to their website. It's spdstar.org. They have tons of research information, tons of literature, lots of good information about what sensory processing disorder is. And she said, the term sensory processing describes the mechanisms of how you feel, and how you feel changes everything. She also said, the conscious experience of the competent self emerges from sensory motor development. The competent self. Isn't that what we want? Isn't that what we want for our kids? To be competent and to feel competent. And I want to highlight the role of sensory motor development in everyday function. If you look at this triangle of learning, you'll see that the central nervous system is on the very bottom. And I know yesterday there was a lot of talk about the nervous system at the cellular level, and a lot of the drug trials and gene therapies are impacting the cellular level. Sensory is just above that because it's about our receptors, and it's about how our bodies receive information, make sense of that information, pun intended, and how we put that information to use. At the very top of this triangle, you'll see academic learning. And on the left, I've added that slide of progression of skills because I think it's really important for everybody who's interacting with a child to remember the demands of a task. If the demands of the task outweigh someone's capabilities, then the tower will crumble, right? Our senses down on the bottom, the sensory motor development, it's like a game of sensory Jenga. If there are pieces missing or if there are holes in that tower, then those demands can crush the tower, especially at times of new learning. Okay? This is another slide I like to share because to me it shows that relationship between brain, body, and behavior. And I'd like people to know that we all have and do sensory processing because we all have brains and bodies. And so sensory challenges, even though they are about neurology and neuroanatomy and how our brain and body works, it's a human condition. It's not just a neural condition. And I like this slide because I want to use it to remind you as parents that you are part of your child's sensory environment by nature of being there, by nature of interacting with them. And so that is a really important thing when we think about intervention. We can use ourselves, and it's what we try to do in every treatment session. Think about the sensory input that you give your children just by nature of interacting with them. So let's talk a little bit about what our senses really are, a little self-explanatory. And before we do that, I want to invite everybody to remove one of our strongest senses, and that's our vision. So I want you to sit there and close your eyes. And I can't really see because of this light in my eyes whether you're doing that or not, so I'm going to trust that you are. So I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to feel your body. I want you to feel where the chair hits you. I want you to feel your feet. I want you to feel where your hands are, where your arms are. I want you to notice the sound of my voice and any other sounds that might be surrounding us. And I want you to feel your temperature. I want you to notice if something is hard or soft, cold or hot. Okay, you can open your eyes. So just a quick little body scan to illustrate all of the senses that are happening all at once. And we used just our basic senses there. We didn't even get into the three lesser known senses of proprioception, vestibular, and a newer one that we talk more about now is interoception. So let's start with vestibular. It's in the middle. I put it in the middle because vestibular is one of our key senses that helps with everything else. Vestibular is about movement and balance. Most of us know that because most of us have felt off balance at one time or another. It originates in the inner ear. But what a lot of people don't know is that the vestibular sense also helps with self-regulation. And I was fascinated listening to Amy's presentation because when we look at muscle tone, when we look at postural stability, when we look at toe walking, all of those things are connected to the vestibular system. And so I want people to remember the dual role that vestibular plays in both self-regulation and motor skills. Proprioception is our joints and muscles. It tells you where you are in space, but it does that by communicating with vestibular and all of your other senses. And then interoception is about our organs and our internal sense of how our state is, our internal state. Are we hungry? What's our heart rate? Do we notice our breath? And as the field of mindfulness has increased for self-regulation, as we understand more from cognitive science and using things like cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety, the issue of interoception has become bigger and bigger. We need an internal sense of ourselves in order to implement those kinds of strategies. And so I really want to highlight here how proprioception, vestibular, and interoception, even though we don't really pay attention to them, they're an inherent part of how we function. And so all of our senses work together, and this is not an accurate diagram, obviously, but I like it because all of the lines back and forth show how every sense works together. It's not a linear pathway, and it's not a direct line to figure out which sensory system isn't working. We can get patterns, we can get a general understanding, but this also shows, with all of these lines, once we add those lines, we really start to develop an embodied sense of self. And it is our senses that give us that overall body awareness and that overall sense of competence for how we can function in the world. So I like this slide because it shows from a neurological level how our senses function. You can see the touch to the finger and the proprioceptive muscle, the proprioceptive sense from the muscle fibers, both of those pathways going through the spinal column, up through the brainstem, through the cerebellum, and to whatever areas need to be processed in the brain. The picture to the right is the actual cellular level. And I actually added this slide last night after listening to the presentations yesterday because I'm fascinated by, obviously, the impact, as I'm sure you are, of all of the gene therapies and all of the clinical trials we'll be seeing. And for me, it registers because it's my world coming together with that world. And all of the neurology that goes into understanding function, never before has the world of sensory and the world of genetics been so close. And it's really, I know you guys are excited, I'm very excited from an academic standpoint. So that's how sensory works in a nutshell. This is what we envision, or what is known as the nosology for sensory processing disorder. This is basically a graph that summarizes the current state of the research and the current terminology to describe sets of sensory challenges. So the first big thing that I like everybody to know is that sensory processing is not a medical diagnosis. Sensory processing disorder is not in the DSM. It's not necessarily controversial anymore like it was for many years, but it's just a framework for understanding which set of challenges somebody might have. And so under that umbrella term of sensory processing disorder, we can see sensory modulation disorder, sensory discrimination disorder on the other side, and the one in the middle is basically what we've been talking about a lot, is motor skills. And so that's sensory-based motor disorder. And then there's subcategories under each of those. One of the biggest researched areas of sensory processing disorder is the sensory modulation. And that's what we mean when we talk about hypersensitivity, hyposensitivity, and sensory craving. So sensory over-responding, a lot of people know that some people are sensitive to sounds, they're sensitive to how things feel, maybe sensitive to movement, maybe just get overwhelmed when there's too much input. And I thought about it yesterday when we were talking about when I was listening about the hyperexcitability. Is that a modulation disorder? It could be. And so I think it's really important when we think about Angelman to consider sensory modulation disorder. Sensory-based motor disorder, we see dyspraxia and we see motor coordination or postural disorders. And so it's not anything new, but these are different terms to describe what we've seen in kids that are struggling with developmental delays. Dyspraxia means poor motor planning, and it's a higher level skill than actual motor coordination. My analogy to understand dyspraxia is think of a basketball game and think of somebody who can do all of the skills you need to do in order to play basketball. So they can dribble, pass, shoot, run, probably a million other things I'm not thinking of, but if you can do all of those things, that's great. That's motor coordination. But if you can't take those skills and execute them in the context of a game and adjust your responses according to what's going on around you quickly, then you can't motor plan. You can't play basketball. And so I see a lot of kids struggle with motor planning, even though they have some pretty good motor coordination. And then sensory discrimination disorder is basically being able to distinguish between different sensations. And it's not done at a cognitive level necessarily, it's done inherently. And so things like hot and cold, being able to discern between tastes or textures, and even some of the sound, we know that a lot of kids on the spectrum struggle to adjust to tonal shifts of voice or prosody of speech. And that could be an auditory discrimination disorder. So all in all, in a nutshell, this is the current state of research, and these are the terms that we use to describe a sensory processing disorder. But what does the research tell us? One of the most recent and I think biggest impact sets of studies that has been completed around sensory processing disorder was completed at the University of California, San Francisco, and these are the white matter brain studies. And what they have found is that children with SPD, specifically sensory modulation disorder, they have different white matter microstructures, specifically in the parietal lobe, which is responsible for a lot of somatosensory processing. And so these sets of studies are really key because what they do is show a possible biological basis for sensory processing disorder and show that it's possible to have an SPD separate from other existing diagnoses. We also know that there's a very big overlap between sensory processing disorder and ADHD. There's a 40% overlap. And so now when a parent calls me and says, well, we think it might be ADHD, we also think it might be sensory, how do we know? I can say, we don't. But it's probably both, because there's a high probability that it's both. But what this also shows is that in a lot of interventions, and I think it's this way with Angelman, in a lot of interventions we need a collaborative approach, because it's usually both. SPD and autism have a huge overlap. There's approximately 90% overlap between sensory issues and autism. And we know that in the general population, there's about 5 to 16% of kids that struggle with sensory challenges. So what do we know about SPD and Angelman? Unfortunately, not much. I would love to say that there are lists of studies to choose from so that we know which interventions to start with, but they just don't exist yet. And so what we do need to do is infer from other existing literature. When I went to search Angelman and sensory, make sure I was on the right track, coming to talk with all of you, I found one study that it looked at sensory processing in Angelman. And what this study showed is that there was a wide variety of sensory processing patterns, no shock, but it did show that there was a dominant pattern of hypo-responsiveness in tactile and vestibular input. So what that means is under-responding to these types of input. And if you remember when I showed the arrows, the input, like processing, input, processing, and output, to me, this means that tactile and vestibular information is not registering accurately in the body. And what that means is we need to enhance that input for kids with Angelman. We need to give a broader amount of tactile and vestibular input. We also know from research that there is, from phenotype studies as well, that there's a big overlap between Angelman and autism. And because we know so much about sensory and autism, I am suggesting that we definitely need to take a look at sensory processing in Angelman. So we don't have conclusions, it's still confusing, we don't have answers, we do have more questions. And I think we can say that sensory relates to Angelman. Angelman has some sensory challenges, and I do have some ideas about where we can start with intervention, but we do need more information. And so what I've done and what I'd like to do for the duration of the rest of my talk is share where I think we can start and some ideas that I have that parents can implement at home. And I'm going to try and save some time for questions. So these are my suggestions about priorities for starting. And I chose these priorities because developmentally, these priorities will support all other areas of function. Stanley Greenspan, who has now passed, is a psychiatrist who developed the DIR floor time model. And it was like a light bulb early in my career when I listened to him speak. And he said a child needs to be self-regulated in order to engage. Once they engage, they can interact. And if you remember the triangle that I posted, at the very top is academic learning. And that is almost the pinnacle of interaction. That's output. That's how we measure whether a child is learning or not, right? Is through the output. How do they show us they know how to do something? And so we need to make sure to get them to that output level with execution that they're regulated. If they're not regulated, they won't be able to engage and they won't be able to interact in their world to learn and to show us what they know. So under self-regulation, I have sleeping, eating, and toileting. How many parents have struggled with one or all three of these issues, right? How do we not when we have children? And these are the three physical tasks of self-regulation: sleeping, eating, and toileting. When these things go awry, life is harder. We know that sleep issues are a part of Angelman syndrome. And so we can't ignore how to support sleep and how to improve sleep. And there are some sensory strategies we can try that we'll talk about. Attention and engagement. These are challenging for almost every child I work with, maintaining attention and then how to keep them engaged. And there's no one right answer, there's no easy answer, but we'll brainstorm a few. Positioning. This came up listening to Amy, alignment and function. We need to focus on position during every activity that our child does. It doesn't mean make their position perfect. It doesn't mean make sure they're aligned, because if our efforts to improve alignment interrupt function, there's no success, and the brain isn't going to want to do it again. So we need to support, like Amy said, support both alignment and function, and we can do that through positioning. And the three areas of positioning that I've chosen to target are tummy time, upright surface, and midline orientation. And I believe that these three apply across our lifespan. I believe in tummy time for everybody, not just infants. I think it's a really important stage and a really important experience, and I'll explain why. And then behavior, because, it's kids. Okay, pillars of intervention. So there are some key things that parents can do to focus on and try to duplicate that I think we try to incorporate into most sessions. The list of things that I think are key to remember are things like grading, joining, allowing failure, it's tough to remember sometimes, pacing, and silence. And so I just want to talk very briefly about those. When I say grading, I mean layering on or layering off a challenge. So when you're trying to teach your child a new skill, or when your child is inherently trying to learn something new, think about that challenge and know that because their nervous system is fluctuating, when there's sensory issues, nervous system tends to fluctuate more. And so on a day that it's hard, just because they've been able to do it before doesn't mean they'll be able to do it again. And so we need to become skilled at layering on and layering off the challenges in order to support success on a given day. And that will build over time. Joining means experiencing whatever emotion the child is having and validating the emotion that they have. This is generally an easier thing for parents to do, sometimes harder for therapists. You are so connected to your kids, but it's empathy. And Dan Siegel, who wrote The Whole Brain Child, has lots of videos on YouTube. I would encourage you to watch some of his stuff or read his book, because it's about connect and redirect. And when we connect with the emotion, we're actually accessing the limbic system in the brain, which allows the nervous system to calm. And I think that this is especially important for kids with Angelman because of that hyperexcitability. And we need to join them in their emotion so we can lead them towards a more regulated functional response when that hyperexcitability is getting in the way. And then allowing failure. Sometimes when we're working with kids who have special needs, and certainly parents of kids with special needs have said this to me, it's hard to let them fail because there's so much difficulty sometimes, right? It feels like that struggle is every day, and it is. And so how do we let them fail when that happens inherently? And I think it's important to let them fail in micro ways so that there's a feedback loop created in the brain from a sensory standpoint. During treatment sessions, I will let a child fall safely, I catch them, but let them fall so they can feel what that's like. In this picture of stacking the marble run, if Chandler dropped that top piece, then he would see what happened, right? If the whole thing fell over, he gets to see that it fell over. Now, we're not going to do that over and over again, and that's where we come to the grading of the task, right? But some failure is really important. And then finally, pacing and silence, slowing things down. This is especially important for children with multisensory processing problems because their brain can't keep up. We as grown-ups have had enough experience to know what's supposed to come next, so we jump to that. And we as grown-ups use our cognitive brains to try and teach. We want to explain and teach our kids what to do and use our words to tell them. But we need to slow down and let them figure out some of those steps for themselves. Again, it doesn't mean, being silent and not helping, but finding ways to slow down so that they can make their own neural connections. So let's talk about what to do, real strategies. This intervention priority is sleep, and we know why. Sleep changes everything, right? And without it, life is harder. I think we all know that. So some sleep considerations in Angelman. The first thing I encourage parents to do is measure a baseline. We all know when sleep is disrupted. But the other thing that happens when sleep gets disrupted is that things seem harder. Our perception is that today is going to be really hard because I didn't get any sleep. But we need to start measuring how much we're getting or they're getting, and we need to discern the difference between is it a difficulty falling asleep or is it a difficulty with night wakings or is it both? Because the interventions for falling asleep look very different than interventions for night waking. There's overlap, of course, because it's all sleep. But I think it also helps parents maintain perspective, and it helps us know when we're making progress. I've had parents come into session, not just with sleep, but with any behavior, and I try to ask my parents to measure some of these things. But I had been working with one young girl for a long time, and I felt like she was improving on a lot of different measures. And the parent came in, and I said, "How was this week?" And she said, "It was awful. It was so awful." I said, "Well, what was awful?" And she said, "The meltdown on Wednesday. It took forever." And I said, "Well, how long did it take?" She said, "Well, probably at least 10 minutes. Right? And in my head, I was like, "Yay, only 10 minutes." Actually, I probably said that. Because when she started, she was having hour-long meltdowns every day. And as time goes on and kids progress, when you're with them every day, we lose sight of how far you've come sometimes with specific behaviors. And this is definitely the case with sleep. And so I encourage parents to measure that baseline. Limit screen use. I don't want to overdo discussion on screen use. I could do an entire lecture on screen time. Martha and David will let you know that I recently co-hosted an initiative within our community on screen time. And I think it's really important, specifically for kids with Angelman, because Kids who struggle with sensory challenges and kids who struggle with motor skills often over-rely on their vision. And the visual system is one of the strongest systems of the body. And so even if it's not working accurately, even if vision is impaired, it's still one of the first line senses that we use in order to function. And there's more and more research coming out about the impact of screens on brain activation. And even when the body looks calm and restful, the brain is active. And there's also a difference between active screen time and passive. So all of these academic learning apps, right? They're scrolling, they're touching, they're doing things. It doesn't look like their bodies are super active, but their brains are. And scrolling and scanning and doing things on apps, that's all active screen time. And I believe, just based on the research I know about screens, that kids with Angelman are at higher risk for screen addictions, and they're also at risk for more susceptibility to the negative impacts of screen time. That's just me, there's no research on that, but based on what I know about screen time and now what I know about Angelman, I'm inferring that. For sleep, we need to build consistent routines and expectations. When things are predictable and familiar, the brain can rest and the nervous system calms. And we need to think about our cues to sleeping. Again, our physical environment gives us visual cues as well as other sensory cues, and so we want to be as calming and supportive as possible. And again, this means you as parents. What are you doing prior to the child going to sleep? We often think about what are they doing and what do we need them to do in that bedtime routine. But you as the parents are modeling self-calming, you're modeling calm down, and you're modeling organization. And so it's good to do lots of different sensory kinds of activities before bed, but it's also important to model what you want for your child. And so slow down for them. Don't go in and out of the bedroom. Don't play big play, hyperactive play, wrestling right in the bedroom right before sleep. Those are some examples. So here are some specific sleep strategies. I encourage people to put stuff in the bed. Do people have kids who sleep with all kinds of blankets and stuffed animals and all that stuff? Sometimes. So sometimes that happens, and the reason is because that gives more of that tactile input. Remember, some people may be lacking, kids with Angelman may be lacking that tactile sense. Remember the hypo-responsiveness, under-responsiveness of touch. So putting things around them, assuming that they're safe to move on their own in their bed, putting things around them will help them feel themselves in that space. For young infants, there are things like sleep hammocks, and then there are some things called, I put this one up there, I have not used it personally, but I think I want to, so if anybody tries it, please let me know how it goes. The Zen sack, this is a new one recently, and it puts a little bit of tiny pressure right here, right near the heart. Ambient lighting and white noise are two kind of common sensory strategies that are pretty generic, but some things that we forget about. Ambient lighting is calming and soothing because it's not as bright. White lights, white Christmas lights, it might be a night light. There are all kinds of projectors that you can buy for the bedroom. I encourage you to play around with those kinds of things. We often assume that a dark space is going to be better, but it's not always better. So having some light, and for older kids, I encourage parents to give them a flashlight so that they can self-soothe themselves when they need it. Glider rockers, this is because with movement, linear and predictable is calming. So glider rockers are back and forth in a linear motion, right? Instead of like this. And so glider rockers might be soothing and calming, again, for any age. And then minimize social interaction when we want sleep. It can feel bad not to respond to our children when they want us at bedtime, and it can feel really bad if they're scared and if they're struggling in any way. But when you minimize that social and that verbal interaction, specifically for kids with Angelman, then that excitability is not going to be triggered. And this is really where you are a therapeutic tool for your children. Eating. Remember, sleeping, eating, and toileting. So eating is an everyday thing. How many times do we do it, right? 3, 4, 5, 6, if we count snacks, sometimes more, 7, 8, depending if we have an infant, it's like around the clock, right? So eating in typically developing children takes up to 4 years. And so when we think of a developmental delay, if eating has been disrupted from the start in some way because of poor oral motor skills, because of reflux, other medical things that come up, then the progression of those eating skills is going to be delayed as well. And often children with developmental delays take longer and more repetition to learn things. And so even when a child can eat, even when we think we know what they're doing, they are perfecting and refining that skill for another 4 years. And this slide shows all of the steps to eating. This is according to the SOS Approach. This is the program I use when I work with kids and families on eating skills. And so you can see that all of these steps start with the tolerating, but it takes a long time to get to eating. And this is with every single food. And there are 5 or 6 steps within each of these steps. So there's like 25 or 30 steps to get to actually eating. And I want parents to realize this when you're presenting foods, when there's a struggle with eating, whether it's using utensils from a motor standpoint or tolerating textures from a sensory standpoint. The first step would be tolerating and interacting with that food in some way. And so how else do we support eating from a sensory standpoint? We want to think about that positioning and that alignment. We can put feet on a stool, find a proper sized chair, make sure that they're sitting upright at the table. No screens, my plug. And try means look, smell, touch, and taste. I want you to think about no longer does here, try this mean eat it, because we can't force a child to eat. Sleeping, eating, and toileting are the 3 things that need to be within a child's control. And no matter how hard we try, they're the 3 things that we as parents can't make them do, right? So we need them to learn it themselves. The golden rule of eating. Parents and kids have a role. It's a parent's job to decide what and when, and it's a child's job to decide if or how much. Okay? And things that you can encourage your child to do if they're upset about the foods in front of them is push it away, cover it up. You can make a try plate so that they can try, touch, taste, smell, see, just look at the food. Okay, that would be the first level. And then encourage napkins. In our feeding program, we go through more plates and napkins than I don't even want to look at in the budget. It's because teach them to spit it out. Teach them to cover it up with a napkin. Teach them to touch it with a napkin, because now they're engaging and they're interacting with that food instead of just throwing it away. If the challenge is overeating, as is sometimes the case when there's oral seeking or when there's just an overeating problem, we still want to use those steps to eating because we want the child to learn how to regulate themselves. So it's on them to decide if and how much they eat, and we can certainly get into that if you have specific questions. Next, toileting. So one of the biggest struggles that I've seen parents have when teaching potty training, and even in working with older children on toileting or toileting hygiene, is which approach to use. There's so much information out there that doesn't work for kids with developmental delays and kids with sensory challenges. And the 2 approaches that I encourage parents to think about are either the boot camp approach, which is do it all at once, right in a weekend, or what's called the structuring approach, which is gradually over time. The answer that I recommend for kids with Angelman is do both. And the reason for that is because a boot camp approach gives them lots of immediate feedback and lots of inherent practice within a short amount of time. But it's not going to be perfected because their brains and bodies are not working the same way. So then the faded practice happens over time. Toileting is a sensory and a motor activity. So we can just go through the senses and realize that. In the bathroom, there's sounds of flushing, there are blow dryers, there's running water, there's echoes. There's often fluorescent or bright lighting or mirrors. There are smells, enough said. I'm not talking about the smelly soap. In voiding and bathroom hygiene, they're both tactile experiences. We want to think about positioning, postural stability, and the interoceptive capacity that a child has. Can they actually tell when they need to go? If they can't tell, and even if they've shown you they can, if they can't tell consistently, then toilet training is going to be really difficult. And with bathroom, anything in the bathroom, it's a multi-stepped sequence. So from a motor planning and even a motor coordination standpoint, there are lots of smaller sub-skills that are required. So here are some suggestions. We want to use modeling and play with an emphasis on the sitting and an emphasis on the try. Try not to reward the success, but reward the attempt and reward the small pieces along the way. Time your trials in the bathroom about 15 to 20 minutes after they deliberately eat or drink. This will increase the likelihood of actual success on the toilet, which will provide that feedback loop that lots of kids need. For positioning, just like in eating, feet on a stool, use a floor potty. Some kids turn around to face the tank so that they can rest. If they're in a forward flexion or if they have low tone, then resting on the back of the tank can actually give them more success while they're using the toilet. Encourage cleanup for mastery. There's a technique called backwards chaining so that you have the child do the last step of a task so that they feel successful. And that works sometimes with toilet training or with toileting hygiene. Meeting the child at their level, and these are I just listed the stages because I think it's important to be realistic and to remember that consistency, that they may perfect it for a little while, regress, and then move forward again, that 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. So meet them where they're at in the process and don't get disheartened. If they could do it and then they regress, again, meet them where they're at. They may need more practice before they can generalize. They may have had independence and mastery, but then they may back up to get more practice. It depends on what the nervous system is doing, it depends on what the stressors are, and it depends on a lot of variables. Next priority, positioning. So this is a diagram from a colleague of mine. Her daughter drew this. Shelley Manel is a physical therapist up in Canada, and she has a program called Dynamic Core for Kids. And her basic tenet is that the diaphragm and the pelvis mirror each other and work in tandem. And the diaphragm and the breath that comes from the diaphragm working with the pelvis supports alignment. And so we want to think about breath and alignment when we're doing activities. And I've recommended tummy time, midline orientation, and an upright surface because these types of strategies get breath, alignment, and support function. So here's some examples. You can see Chandler on the platform swing here. This platform swing is not moving in this scenario, but the movement might facilitate more activation, but in a supported way when he's on his stomach. You can see he's not fully on his stomach there, but that's okay, and that's what I wanted to point out, because tummy time also for older kids means weight bearing. On the elbows, you get shoulder stability, you get postural extension, and you can see him on the scooter board there. Again, he's getting a little weight bearing on the forearms, and Amy talked about crawling and the importance of crawling. Kids who struggled with crawling early on need all of the tactile feedback on their hands to develop more skills later, fine motor. And you can see in both of these slides, visually, he's focused on what's right in front of him. So when we think about doing tasks standing up, there's a lot more visual. When we're down, looking at something right here, the vision focuses, and then we're getting more ocular motor control, we're getting divergence and convergence. There's a lot going on when we're doing something in prone on our tummies. Midline orientation. Here you can see Chandler on the bolster swing. And while, yes, he's working on balance and using right-left, you can see there's a whole lot more going on in this picture, right? Look how happy he is. And so doing high fives on that swing, he's crossing midline, or at least trying to achieve midline, which gets a lot of good activation. And again, visual motor. He's connecting the two together, which is going to be really important later for things like printing. And the other slide there, I'm working on, that was actually an activity where he would reach over, grab the ball, bring it here, and then pass it up here. And so there's head rotation, which gets that vestibular input. Remember, in Angelman, under responsiveness of vestibular, so we want to give head rotation or movement as much as we can. And then overhead, he's getting a lot of good proprioceptive input through his shoulders and his upper extremities. But he's doing it all while being midline oriented, which supports that more progression towards a more narrow base. Here's a little slide of Chandler and I. Beep, 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 beep. Beep, beep, beep. The horn on the bus goes beep, beep, beep. All through the town. Yay! Now what part should we do? The doors? The doors on the bus? Yeah? Okay, so like this. Okay, ready? Doors on the bus go open and shut. Open and shut. Open and shut. The doors on the bus go open and shut. All through the town. And he's done. Now, should we do the people on the bus go up and down? Should we go up and down? We're not done the song yet. Finish song, then all done. Simple. Okay, for the people, this is what we're going to do. Ready? Ready? See? We're going to stand all on the bus go. Oh, we forgot our wheel. Look at Miss Nancy has one. So you hold this. People on the bus go up and down. Up and down. People on the bus go up and down. Through the town. Yeah. Thank you. Upright surface. So upright surface, same as the other, promotes alignment, encourages core activation, builds upper extremity strength through flexion against gravity, and supports visual motor integration by placing the items at eye level, very much like the prior slides.
Dab.
This is Miss Nancy.
Oh, look at you painting. Okay, ready? Do you want to do another color? Should we do yellow? Okay.
Say yayo.
We're putting the red there.
Yayo.
Here we go.
And dab, dab, dab. Your turn. Dab, dab, dab. Dab, dab, dab. You want to do yellow?
Visually directed hand.
You want to do red?
Easier to get to the upright surface.
Want to get some more paint? Can Miss Nancy do some? Yeah?
No, I'm good. You do it.
Should we get, we're going to make some orange. Are you ready to make orange? Watch this, Chandler.
Behavior. What do we want to think about with behavior? Specifically as related to Angelman, we want to think about the laughing and hyperexcitability, and does that impede function? We want to think about seeking behaviors, because we see a lot of those, and you saw Chandler chewing on his jacket, but as Amy pointed out, it may be purposeful. Social engagement and capacity, but how much does that impede other skills? So we want to use it mindfully. And what is the level of distractibility and impulsivity? And so here are two key strategies and types of activities that can support attention and engagement, thus support behavior. And notice that I said support engagement and attention, not how do we address behavior. And I did that intentionally because sometimes the best way to address a behavior is not to address the behavior. We come in the back door. And so by providing sensory input, in this case, remember, tactile and vestibular, by providing enhanced amounts of the input a child needs, we might see less of the behavior that's impeding function. So some examples of providing tactile play: messy play, which is the bane of probably every parent's existence. I encourage putting things in the bathtub. Bathtubs are great places for messy tactile play. Play-Doh and cookie cutters, sandbox or water play with items to find under the bubbles. Arts and crafts, and for older age children, arts and crafts are always a good thing. Creating movement opportunities, climbing, running, jumping, outdoor play, playgrounds, hiking, biking. You get so much vestibular and proprioceptive input through these kinds of things. And then enhancing input through daily activities like loofah brush, burrito wraps with the towels after bath time, hugs and squeezes, wearing tighter fit clothing, buying heavier boots, specifically in the winter. That'll give lots of good feedback when a child is walking. And then minimizing visual distractions or aversions, and use of more structured strategies like peer modeling, picture schedules, shaping through faded hands-on support. And here's a little clip of this therapist, Miss Leslie, who worked with Chandler for a long time, addressing what looks like a behavior.
Green.
Oh, he said orange the other day.
Orange. Uh-oh. Here, you can put them in the bag. Oh, put them in.
So did you see that as soon as she told him what he could do and presented it in a way that made him successful at doing that, then the messing around stopped. It wasn't that he couldn't follow directions. It wasn't that he didn't want to or that he wasn't engaged with the task. He was engaged. He was doing his own thing with it. I am hypothesizing that it was too hard for him. And so he defaulted to what he could do. And you saw him drop one on the ground. That was cause and effect. So he's defaulting to a lower level response. And she didn't respond by saying, no, do this. She responded with, you can put them in the bag. So he's still engaged with whatever they're doing. And so this discussion of behavior loops back to basically remind us all that every behavior has meaning, and our senses are what help us produce behaviors. And so when we use a sensory lens to try and understand behavior, we start to see what that child's experience might be. And when we join them in that experience and structure it in a sensory supportive way, we get better function. And so I hope that you'll agree with me that sensory processing disorder is not the end of the world. It is the beginning of a whole new world. And I will add that it gives us access to our world. Thank you.
We have about 5 minutes for questions. So if folks have any questions, I'm not sure if we have mics or not. If we don't, then we'll have, we'll repeat the question so that folks who are live streaming or watching later can hear the question as well. I see one question right here. Go right ahead.
Our son has always hated shoes. Recently we had a snowfall, so we got him snow boots, which are pretty loose, easy to put on. Mm-hmm. I went to put them on. He started screaming like I've never seen him scream before, even though he's always worn shoes as hard as they are to put on. Mm-hmm. So I was taken aback, and I had no idea what to do besides keep putting them on. And then the second his feet hit the ground and he could walk, perfectly fine. It was like nothing had happened, but it took a half an hour. Yeah. So what do we do in those situations?
So shoes and socks are one of the most common tactile questions that I get. And my first answer is deep pressure, squeezing. I mentioned squeezes and hugs throughout the day. If you put pressure and squeeze firmly, but you don't want to crush their foot, but squeezing on the skin activates deep pressure receptors that then provide some inhibition to the light touch receptors that are overfiring. So I would do squeezes and teach them to march once they're on, squeeze before and after, and see if that makes a difference. When kids have hypersensitivity, or when they've had it most of their life, they develop what's called a sensory affective response. So that's an emotion tied to that trigger. And so the more that you can do to be supportive emotionally, not rise during those situations, but add the physical as well, hopefully that response will shift.
Thank you.
Okay.
Super.
Right. I can't. it's
So
hard
I
for me to
have,
see, so.
hi, I have two questions. So, we don't do a lot of screen time, but we do use a talking device. Like, oh, you want water? Do you want juice? You choose. So the talking device is with us all the time to help with communication. Does that count as screen time? That is bad because with an AS child, you kind of use it to communicate, and it's
Right.
with us all the time to
So
tell what he wants.
I would encourage you to think big picture and
Okay.
think about your overall day and what other types of screen time they're getting or not getting.
That's-
Because we
yeah.
can't get away from using adaptive devices, and we can't get away, don't want to. I mean, technology is a benefit. So that's not bad, and technology, even active use of screens, is not bad. But it's overuse of screens, and this is the other reason that I do think some kids with special needs are at greater risk, because they are using devices to access communication, and that's good, but we want to balance it. And so I would be careful about the rest of the time and the types of screen time that you're presenting outside of using that device.
And one more question.
Yeah.
When should they potty train if they're not walking yet? Should you wait till they're walking, or should you attempt it?
Every child is different, and I think you have to follow their lead with readiness and remember those phases, engaging. Start with engaging. If they're not walking, but they have some interoceptive sense of their bladder and they know when they have to go and when it's full, then don't wait. Build on what they're giving you. But if they're not walking and they haven't yet shown any interest, then pushing with toileting you're not going to be successful anyway. Likely.
Hi, our angel is around 19, right here.
Hi.
I stand up so you can see me.
That's okay.
So our angel is around 19.
Yes.
But at around age 13, he began to develop like sensory overload anytime that we would go out or have parties or invite people over to our house, to where he would become more excited, yell out, and even vomit in restaurants and any place like that.
Yeah.
Now, we refuse to keep him at home, so we're going to take him out and expose him to the public and keep our life as typical as
Sure.
possible. So what do you suggest for dealing with that overloading of sensory in those situations?
Yeah, great question, and a question I get at every age. When somebody's sensory system is overwhelmed, the first line is removing the triggers, and I encourage parents to create a sensory break, go to a quieter space with dimmer lighting. And so removing sound and removing visual input can immediately start to calm the system. But I encourage parents to plan ahead so that the entire experience is going to be less overwhelming. And so I think it's having conversations if you're going to a family outing. I think it's selecting restaurants that are going to be a little more supportive. And I think it's having some things with you, even if it's taking a sensory break in the car or going to the bathroom if that's not an overstimulating place. But taking these intermittent breaks and planning ahead can preemptively give you guys the information and the support you need so you're not making decisions in the moment, but also then pacing it for him when you're out. And again, finding what does work for him when you're in different such situations and brainstorming how to get doses of that input when you're out and about.
I got it. We've done a lot of redirecting to where we take the iPad with us or something like that, to shift his focus to something that makes him more comfortable.
Yep.
So that we can experience whatever the event is with the
Yes.
entire family. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
Yeah,
I don't know.
absolutely.
I don't know if that's good or bad, but that's,
So I think it's a double-edged sword. So it's not good or bad. I would encourage you to find other things that can be used as well as the iPad. And when you're using the iPad, use it with him, so that there is a sharing and that joining, remember? Because what happens with the iPad when it becomes in teenagers, it's like their only thing often, right? But the iPad is put on a pedestal and they tune out other inputs. And for self-calming and self-regulation, we want them feeling their bodies. We want them grounded in their bodies so that they can calm without that. So do both.